Today we will be talking with Cathryn Anneka, a PhD design researcher who is writing her PhD in mechanical textile recycling. And we will cover a lot of great topics such as recycled, circular and sustainable fabrics, alternative materials, circular fashion, and other great topics. Without further ado, Anneka, the word is yours, and please introduce yourself to us.
Sure. So as you've already explained, I am a PhD researcher at the Centre for Circular Design, which is a part of the University of the Arts London. I've been doing my PhD for 3 years, but prior to that, I used to be a designer in the fast fashion industry, a knitwear designer, so designing jumpers for the high street and all sorts of stuff like that. I kind of saw the kind of firsthand what the fast fashion industry was like, and so I went back to university, and I've been in academia for the last 5 years.
That's amazing. You've been in the field for so long, so I guess you have seen the textile industry from very different angles. So could you just start from very first question, which is, what is textiles?
So textiles kind of covers a whole bunch of things. So as I said, I worked in the fashion industry, so obviously textiles includes clothing, as well as kind of performance things. So as you know, astronaut suits, that kind of thing. It also covers interiors, but textiles actually find themselves in all sorts of different places that you might not expect them, particularly hidden applications. So you might think of textiles within cars, but also probably inside the seating, hidden behind dashboards and things, you'll find textiles. And another place that we kind of forget that textiles are kind of hiding are within our clothes. So things like interfacings or the stuff that are in collars to make them stiff. So yeah, textiles are all over the place and in often places that you don't expect.
Okay, yes, because usually when we think about textiles, I think immediate association that we have is clothing, which is something that we wear every day, and we kind of take it for granted that actually our chairs and sofas and car seats are all also covered in textiles.
Yeah, it's a huge, huge industry when you take it. I mean, obviously fashion is a massive industry, but when you start expanding it, you realize how big the industry actually is.
And within the textiles, there are different types of materials being used, right? Is there a specific classification of those fabrics and materials?
Yeah, so in terms of those textiles, they generally get split between natural materials and man-made materials. But depending on how detailed you get, you can also think about them in terms of animal materials, vegetable or plant materials, or kind of oil, mineral-based materials. So, for example, you might have wool in the animal category, cotton in the vegetable category, and something like polyester or nylon in the man-made mineral type category. But you can get even more specific, which I won't do right now, and geek out on all the different types of materials that there are out there.
All right. In the last 2 talks that I had before, we were talking with 2 founders of startups who use leftovers from different productions like silk or leather, and they transform them into other pieces. And today, together with you, we are talking more about, okay, what does it actually happens afterwards? Once we have worn everything out and our clothes go into like kind of like the last phase of the product's life or use. So talking about this last step, which I would call a take back, that would be also one of the measures would be recycling, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So actually, when it comes to recycling, the word recycling, and I've said this multiple times, kind of encompasses a lot more than you realize. So when we talk about textile recycling, we might be referring to reusing our clothes, whether that's sending them to a charity shop or lending them to a friend. But it also might be remaking them. So thinking about those kind of like upcycling challenges where you turn, I don't know, an old pair of curtains into a dress or something like that. That also might be deemed as recycling. And then, of course, you have the recycling, which is the kind of pulling the fibers out of the cloth and then returning them back into textiles. And that type of recycling is called mechanical recycling. But you can also recycle by using chemicals, where chemicals are used to dissolve the fibers, and then you can return them back into yarns and then textile materials.
That sounds like a very complex system. Are those both methods available for all types of fabrics that you just mentioned in the beginning, or are they peculiar to different fabrics?
So yeah, so you've got these two main types of recycling. You've got the mechanical side and you've got the chemical side. But actually, and I'll probably say this many times over, it's kind of about appropriateness. So while theoretically you can mechanically recycle any type of material, it actually lends itself really well to things like wool or cotton. Whereas on the chemical side, if you tried to chemically recycle wool, it's completely possible, but you wouldn't be able to turn that back into textiles again. It would be used for something else, which is no bad thing. But if we're looking at kind of a textile to textile process and talking about how we can turn textiles back into other textiles, then chemical recycling wouldn't necessarily be very appropriate. Whereas chemical recycling for polyester, for example, works really, really, really well. And you can recycle polyester back into textiles really easily through a chemical process.
I see. Also, there is a huge talk about usability of those fabrics after they have been recycled. When it comes to recycled polyester or recycled cotton, doesn't the fiber shortens, and so recycled material is not suitable to be used as a raw material for new production?
Yeah, so that's true. When it comes to the mechanical process, because you've got this machinery that literally is ripping the fibers, it's an old technology that was developed in 1813 in the UK. Yeah, a really long time ago. And they developed it because of a shortage of wool. So there was a shortage, so they wanted to be able to recycle the wool. So they created these machines, and the easiest way to get the fibers, you know, the tiny hair-like fibers, out of the material was to rip them out through the machinery. That machinery has progressed and got better. So what was quite a raw, not quite so great process, has got better. But you're right, the fibers do shorten. It's just the nature of the fact that you're ripping out the process. You can do it dry, you can do it wet. There's lots of different engineering kind of that's going on in the background. But actually, although there is a little bit of quality loss, there are things that you can do in order to combat that. So if you're using recycled materials, blending those recycled materials in with stronger, maybe virgin materials, or perhaps recycled materials from other sources. So we often see that garments have a percentage of, say, recycled polyester in them. And that recycled polyester might come from plastic bottles, for example. And that recycled polyester from a plastic bottle, polyester is a very strong fiber, it's very long, and the recycling process that's coming from plastic bottles is much easier to do to create those long fibers, because polyester is a filament, so it's much longer. And therefore you can kind of mix and match. And as a designer, that's kind of what I'm looking into, understanding how as a designer we can think about using those materials and working with some of the limitations of the process.
I see. Actually, at this point in our conversation, I would just like to step back a little bit and paint a scene for a regular person. So let's say I buy a new garment from a fashion brand. I wear it, and then I maintain it well. So I fix it, small holes or anything like that. And then when the time comes, I decide that, okay, now I need to discard it. So when we come to that phase, what options do I actually have? How do I do it properly?
Well, it's a great question. So I've lived in the UK most of my life. I currently am in Denmark, but I'm going to talk about it from a UK perspective. So in terms of it being across the world, that will slightly vary and be slightly different. But from a UK perspective, I always tell people that if they are wanting to get rid of their clothes, first of all, think about whether, I know you said that you may have repaired it and all of those things, but could it be reused by somebody? Is it reusable? Because in that case, I would say that you want to be donating that item of clothing probably to a charity shop, particularly if it's something that you think that somebody else in the UK might want to wear. Plus the charity benefits off the fact that you've donated. If it's an item of clothing that you don't think anyone really is going to want to wear, so prime examples of these are tights, old pants, socks, the odd sock that you can't find the pair to, that kind of thing, then I would suggest that you put those items into one of those recycling banks that you quite often find in car parks that collect the materials, and then they get sent through to sorting centres, and then they can sort those out and decide whether they are reusable to be sent elsewhere in the world, because that's how the textile recycling system works. Or whether they can be sent into higher value markets, whether that goes back into the UK if they have that system in place, or whether that's going to somewhere like Eastern Europe, which wants the kind of newer, brand new things that people are getting rid of. So they're kind of your two options.
All right. Yeah. And then, so let's say I discard of my items through one of these options. But is this something that can be found everywhere around the world? You just mentioned what's the system in the UK. Would you say the coverage is actually well developed within entire Europe?
Well, actually, interesting that you said that, because in Europe, they're just bringing in law through the EU that textiles have to be collected as a separate waste stream by 2025. And that's a really exciting piece of policy, because we're quite good across the UK. We could be better. There's massive work to be done. There's a figure that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation always put out, that something like 73% of all textiles ends up in landfill, because we are really great at throwing our clothes away. But when it's captured and goes into recycling streams, it's not brilliant at being captured in all of these different places. So this law is trying to encourage people from stopping to throw that textiles away. The stuff that is captured isn't always ending up in recycling. Sometimes it goes off to be incinerated. So we have this sort of ideal that we want to be reusing our textiles, then potentially remaking them into something else, then recycling, and then incineration, and then, to be completely avoided, landfill, to be honest, at all costs. So yeah, it's not available anywhere. I know that here in Denmark, there's no recycling facilities. So in terms of the collecting, they have to be sent elsewhere to be sorted, recycled, whether that gets reused, whether that's actually physically recycled. So not every country is the same. In the UK, we have some recycling, but lots of stuff gets transferred elsewhere. The recycling industry is quite global, and I know from some research that went on in Africa, which I think was Ghana, but I could be wrong. I'll double check that, maybe put that in a comment afterwards. But their collection facilities for old clothes doesn't exist, and therefore lots of clothing does end up in landfill in countries that doesn't have that kind of structure. So in terms of Europe, we do have that kind of collection structure, but elsewhere in the world that doesn't exist. And to be honest, in Europe, it could be much improved.
I can totally agree to you. I am coming from Lithuania originally, and when I was living there, I wouldn't say that we would have a well-developed system, that I would have a place to discard my clothes. I was very happy when H&M came into the marketplace and I could bring my old clothes to their shop. I'm not quite sure how well are they with sorting and recycling and actually using the products that they receive. But I am just happy that at least here in Denmark, the coverage is better and it seems to be improved across Europe. Where would you say are the hotspots, so to say, of the recycling centers, sorting centers and recycling facilities?
So actually, interestingly, H&M collaborate with a company called ICO, which stands for I Collect. So actually, the clothing that you do donate to H&M does get collected and does get sorted within the ICO facilities, which are based in various locations around Europe. I think they're predominantly based in Germany, or at least their head office is there. So in terms of donating to somewhere like H&M, rest assured that your clothing is going to a recycling system in the same way that if you put it into one of those recycling banks, it's a similar sort of process. I don't know what happens to it after that. I assume it just goes into a more general system, but they are working on and developing and trying to understand what we can better do with our clothes, which is what it's the big question everybody's asking. But in terms of hotspots, aside from sorting facilities that happen in specific countries, so in the UK, there is some sorting, but then there are other sorting hubs, so to speak. And I know that there's one in India where clothing can be imported into these special economic zones. So India as a country actually bans the import of secondhand clothing. They don't want to disrupt their own markets. They don't want to kill off the textile industry that they have, but they have special economic zones where it can go in, these businesses sort, and then they can be re-exported or sent into the country where they have recycling facilities. At this point, I should probably mention that my research is particularly focused on wool and acrylic recycling. So in terms of those hubs for recycling, wool recycling happens in a place called Prato in Italy, which is just outside of Florence, where they have a wool recycling industry that's been there for almost as long as textile recycling has existed. And then you also have places in northern India. Southern India tends to have more cotton recycling. There's some businesses in Spain that do cotton recycling. So you can kind of see there are lots of examples that I could tell you all over the world, but there tends to be these sort of where businesses gravitate together to have these recycling facilities. When we look at Prato, for example, they also have a really big virgin wool production. So it makes sense that you've got this virgin wool production alongside the recycling production so that you can take waste from one production, also import waste clothing and get that recycled as well. So it balances out.
You just mentioned that, for example, India doesn't want to disrupt their own textile industry. And that raises my other question, which is, whose interest is it to actually get the recycled materials? Is it the government's interest? Is it the big brands' interest?
Well, I would say that you have to remember that the recycling industry is not funded. I'm specifically talking about the UK when I say that, actually, because there are initiatives in some countries where, so for example, in France, where they have the extended producer responsibility, which means that every item of clothing, I think it's a penny or the equivalent of, or a few pennies attached to each item of clothing in order at the end of life so that it can be recycled or go through those systems and invest and et cetera, et cetera. And there's lots of different initiatives happening all over the place. Sweden has a slightly different system that they're thinking about implementing. But really, no one's really investing in this. It's not like there's a global textile union that everyone has to be a part of, and this global fashion initiative. So really, it's a combination of the demand from the consumer, as we've seen over the last few years, this sort of booming of Extinction Revolution and climate crisis. I mean, we've kind of known about the problems within textiles and design and fashion for much longer than suddenly all of these kind of campaigns, which are amazing and brilliant that people are sort of starting to realize, and slightly worryingly it's looking like it's getting quite late in the day to be doing anything about it. So really, because it's a business and because each of these individual tiny businesses that make up this entire industry obviously run on profit and having to make money, there is no incentive other than to try and be green So there is a bit of push from the fashion companies. There's also a bit of push from the consumer, but equally all of these businesses that are sort of trying to make that happen also have to work as businesses, and they have to make sure they can pay their employees and things. So it's slightly more complicated than going, oh yes, absolutely, the fashion brands need to do this, or oh, the consumer needs to be buying into this. It's a combination of everything.
I see, and it makes sense. It's because there are a lot of actors involved in the process, and at the end of the day, we are talking about money. It's a money game in this capitalistic environment that we live in. So in that regard, it makes sense. I was actually just then wondering, what are the key challenges that we face when it comes to mechanical recycling?
So I think we've covered quite a few of the problems. So in terms of collecting clothes, which we've kind of discussed already, is a massive sort of hotspot of the problem. You've then got the sorting problems. So I talked a little bit about reuse, but when we collect textiles, again, because the collectors are businesses and the sorters are businesses, they sort them for reuse, which is absolutely the correct way to do it, because we want to be reusing our clothes before we go into these next stages. However, because everything is collected for reuse, the proportion of the unwearable, unreusable textiles that you sort of get left with, there's not a great incentive to sort that properly into contingents ready, so that wool can be recycled over here and cotton can be recycled over there and polyester gets recycled over here. Equally, the recyclers have to run a business, so they have to be able to process this material, which quite often we screw up because we put zips and buttons and we blend fibers together, mixed fibers and stuff. So you've got cotton and wool and polyester and cotton, which makes it really difficult to recycle. So what you have is this kind of, everyone kind of blames each other. So the recyclers blame the designers because the designers are putting all this mixed fiber in. The designers are saying, well, actually, the recyclers are not giving us the recycled fibers we need to be able to put them into our textiles. And then the recyclers are going, well, actually, it's the sorters, because you need to sort this out properly in order for us to recycle it. And the sorters are like, well, you're mixing everything, so we can't sort it properly. So, and it just continues round in this vicious cycle of everyone kind of blaming each other. But equally, that's sort of a problem that needs to be solved. So we need more transparency in the ways and the materials that we're using to design and how we're designing them, so that it's easier for the sorters, so that the sorters can turn profit and be profitable to be able to sort those for recycling, and then equally have recycling technology, so that we can produce materials that are usable by the designers. So there's solutions to be found in all areas.
I can see that. And you mentioned that we have a problem with blended fabrics. Could you maybe just elaborate on that?
Yeah, so blends are one of the biggest challenges to recycling. And we tend, as textile designers, and I did textile design when I was doing my BA. Obviously, I went and was a knitwear designer, and now I'm looking into textiles again. So we blend in loads of different ways. So we can blend at yarn level, so that the fibers are literally twisted together. We can blend by using two different fabrics and putting them together. So a prime example of a really difficult to recycle item is something like a coat, where you've got an outer fabric that's one fabric, but a lining that is a different fabric. You might have an interfacing that's made of something completely different. The care label might be made of a different fabric. It probably has buttons or zips on it, which definitely can't go through recycling machines, and those need to be taken off. So as you can see, the problems sort of escalate and escalate and escalate.
I can see that completely. And I was thinking as well, in one of your research projects, which is Mr. Future Fashion, the key finding is that there is no specific sustainable textile fabric. Better production is the most pressing. That's the quote I found on one of the resources on your website. And I would like to ask you about that? Is this true? Do we really not have anything else? Like, do we not have anything to do with the fabrics? And if not, what are the design approaches we could take?
So I think it's really interesting because, of course, there is things that we can do and we can think about when we, as designers, are using materials, and selecting materials is really, really important. I'm going to go back to that being like appropriate idea, that it really depends on what you're designing, depends on what the material is that you should be choosing. It would be foolish to say, oh, organic cotton is the best thing, we should be using it for everything, because it's obviously totally inappropriate. There's a reason that not all of our clothes are cotton in the first place. If you want to be warm, you definitely won't be wearing a cotton t-shirt, for example. You'd be wearing like a nice woolly jumper. So that kind of applies to design in general. And the same applies for sustainability when we're thinking about the best fabrics to be using. You also talked a little bit about production, and actually this is where circular design thinking comes in. So circular design is all about thinking about the entire life cycle of a product. So that means thinking about the raw materials that then get turned into textiles. So if we take cotton, for an example, you've obviously got the cotton plant, that then gets turned into cotton yarn, which maybe gets knitted into jersey fabric, which will then be turned into the t-shirt. But even through that process, you've got things like bleaching. It might be dyed. There'll probably be finishing processes. You've probably got multiple different companies doing lots of those different things: the spinning, the knitting, the manufacturing. And then obviously it's processed, packed up, transported to a shop. The customer goes in, buys said t-shirt. The customer then washes, uses, does all sorts of stuff with it, and then it needs to be collected to be ready to hopefully be recycled, reused, all of those things, ready to be turned back into a raw material. And you can kind of go all the way around the cycle. And the idea is that you as a designer are thinking about every single stage. However, every single stage is not completely up to the designer. You need to collaborate with some of those people. I definitely am no expert on chemicals, for example. So if I was going to be thinking about the best chemicals to use, I would need to speak to somebody that knows. I probably will have quite specific ideas about the color that a t-shirt might need to be, for example. So I will need to speak to somebody about what the best dyes, what those chemicals would be, and how to achieve the color that I'm looking for as a designer, for example. A bit easier if you're an independent designer to be able to shift and change, whereas a very large company, it's slightly more difficult to make massive changes, which also impacts, you know, things like social things like jobs and the people working in the factories. You don't want to make a massive change that is going to very negatively impact some of those workers and some of those things. So there's a lot to be considered around this sort of life cycle and circle.
Absolutely. The industry, where a lot of parties are interconnected and everyone is looking for their own interest as well and to protect their own interest. We briefly touched upon EU bodies that stepping into the recycling and putting up some regulations. We actually received one question up front from our audience, which touches upon some organizations. For example, when it comes to wool, right? Maybe Woolmark could have a say in fostering or imposing circular thinking and more sustainable materials.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. In terms of those kind of bodies, you know, lots of brands looked at those kind of bodies. So if I was speaking to them and advising them, I would very much encourage them to be taking a stance in that kind of way. But we have to, with these kind of certifications and companies that kind of offer these sort of certificates and things, there become so many of them that actually sometimes adhering to one can contradict another. Because there's a lot of certifications out there that we can use as textiles, it can be quite confusing, and what one certification might mean then doesn't apply with another certification. So I think we have to be a bit careful, because in order to design for the entire life cycle. There are so many decisions. And we actually found this when I worked as a research assistant at the Centre for Circular Design, not only on the Mistra Future Fashion project, which you mentioned, but also was privy to some of the work on the EU Trash to Cash project, which was EU 2020 Horizon funded. And it was about thinking around this entire life cycle. And often when you make one decision, sort of here on the life cycle, maybe about the chemicals, about this, it actually has a massive impact at some other point in the circle. So one decision, a prime example, is about designing for longevity, making sure that we can keep our clothes for longer, might have a detrimental impact on the recyclability. So if you took a t-shirt that was 100% cotton, if you blended 50-50 cotton polyester, the fabric might actually last longer because polyester is stronger, it's more durable, it washes easier. But by making it more durable, you've instantly made it more difficult to recycle. So there are sometimes compromises that need to be balanced.
I can totally agree to that. And I was also thinking about another design approach, for example, design for disassembly. Is this something applicable to textiles industry?
Design for disassembly absolutely is applicable. My PhD colleague, who is just finishing her PhD at the Centre for Circular Design, Letitia Forst, she will publish probably within the next few months, we're hoping. And she's written some papers, so have a look at her stuff, looking at textile disassembly. The issue with textiles and disassembly is that you can only do it at certain levels, because the disassembly at fiber level or yarn level would be recycling. Is the equivalent, that's the way, but it's very difficult when you've got a mix of tiny fibers to be able to sort out the cotton ones from the polyester ones, which is why chemical recycling is a sort of new and exciting technology that's coming up. I will caveat that chemical textile recycling is very much possible, but at the moment is on a smaller scale, pilots, and sometimes at lab scale, depending on the company that's developing it. We've seen H&M using a product called Circulose, which is a chemically recycled cotton, which is very exciting. But at the moment, the chemical recycling of our textiles isn't commercialized to its full potential. And so it's not a complete solution at the moment, but hopefully will be in the future.
As we briefly touched upon alternative materials, such as cellulose, what is your standpoint about other materials? For example, you also explained about polyester material from recycled bottles, let's say from the campaign of cleaning the ocean. And in that relation, I would also like to pick up one of the first questions in our chat, which is in relation to whether plastic bottles are not toxic to us. Our listener says plastic bottles have toxic chemicals that were not meant to be used in garments. Isn't bad to use it in garment?
So yeah, this is a massive concern. I think something that we don't know enough about. The Cradle to Cradle Institute are very much looking into this idea of safe and unsafe chemicals, and it's definitely a resource. Check out their website and see what they're saying, and they have a list of chemicals. Chemicals, as I said, is not my total area of expertise. So when we're thinking about plastic bottles and turning them into textiles, there is always that sort of potential that it is unsafe. What I would say is that we use loads of fairly toxic dyes, treatments of leather, all sorts of things. So if we're going to get picky about the recycling of plastic bottles, we also should be addressing lots of the other toxic chemicals that are washing around, and leaching into the environment. So yes, that is a concern, and more research definitely should be done on that, about how to recycle and recycle safely, which is why my research is looking at how we can recycle textile to textile, bringing in materials from other resources. As I think I've said before, is no bad thing. It's not a problem. The issue that we have as in the fashion and textile industry is that because we're really rubbish at recycling clothing, we're bringing these materials in and then it sort of stops right there, and are not able to go on. So we kind of need to fix that problem, and then hopefully some of the scientists thinking about the chemicals and stuff, hopefully doing some research and understanding the implications of those, because yeah, I'm aware of that as well.
Mm-hmm. And what are the characteristics and qualities of recycled materials and their blends with virgin materials? Let's say it's recycled cotton and it's a blend with virgin cotton or some polyester. So I'm just wondering, how easy is it to recycle those type of blends where there's a virgin material and a recycled material?
So theoretically, no problem at all. It's mainly the type of material. Obviously, you have slightly shorter fiber length. As far as I'm aware, materials should be able to be recycled multiple times through a mechanical process until the fibers are too short to be able to go through the machines. But at that point, if you're blending, and hopefully the garment will have been used for long enough that it kind of makes it worthwhile. But having a recycled content in there shouldn't affect its onward recyclability too much, unless we are getting to the point where we're using so much recycled content and so little virgin that we're a long way off that to be worrying about that as a problem at the moment.
I see. So it's not possible to have 100% recycled t-shirt, for example.
So you could, it just depends on what source you're getting the recycled material from. So you could take mechanically recycled cotton and blend it with recycled polyester from plastic bottles, for example, and then it would be 100% recycled. The aim for 100% recycled is a really great one, but I sometimes think that we get slightly clouded wanting to achieve that aim, that we forget that it's slightly more complicated than that, and that we want to make sure that what we're designing and creating is good quality. And should you create something that's not going to last as long just so that you can say it's 100% recycled, I'm sort of playing devil's advocate there, but sometimes again you've got to think about the appropriateness of what you're doing. It's a lovely story, and it's amazing PR if you can get to 100% recycled. But actually, can we envision a time where we have no virgin materials? Are we going to stop growing cotton and stop shearing sheep at all? Yes, those materials should and probably will become more expensive, but I can't imagine a time where we won't, even in a small way, be growing and doing something in a much more sustainable way, of course, than we currently are. And that's the problem, is that we're doing this on such scale in such a terrible way that it's causing such detrimental effects. So yeah, I think sometimes thinking about the wider implications rather than just focusing on we must get this 100% is an interesting way of looking at things and discussing and thinking about the problem.
And as I hear, it's also not necessarily only about the material itself, like cotton. Cotton has been a great material and still continues to be, but it's about the production process and the implications to the environment primarily.
Absolutely. Yeah, so when you look at some of the research that's been done out of the Ministry of Future Fashion, but in particular, because I worked on that, so I'm aware of quite a lot of that research, the life cycle analysis that was done by Sandra Roos and various other people on her team came out that actually most of the impacts are at the production phase. So that would be particularly weaving, notably, is really energy intensive. So at the moment, because we're working with traditional energy sort of methods or production of energy for these processes, they're coming out really, really high and are particularly bad on the scale rather than necessarily the materials or the transport. Another really interesting fact that came out of that was that one of the biggest factors was if you as a consumer jump in your car and go to a shop and buy one t-shirt, that is a huge impact, because you're taking your car and driving it and the impacts involved, and because you're taking it just for that, it only counts, the impact is only counted for the t-shirt because that was the only reason that you went. Now, of course, you might go to the shops and buy multiple things, so therefore that impact can be split out and it's quite difficult to measure these things. but yeah, it's really interesting that there are lots of different places around the life cycle, that it's not just about materials, and that we do need to think about those production. I mean, I gave the example of thinking about the chemicals used, but also the ways that you're producing, as well as some of the social issues, which I also raised about, you know, the people working and stuff. There's lots of things to think about when you're thinking about sustainability in terms of the textiles and fashion industry.
Absolutely. And Ellen MacArthur Foundation also points out 3 key pillars for circular economy to take place. And we already discussed 2 of them, producing by using renewable energy. Another pillar is designing out waste and pollution. And the third one is keeping products and materials in use. So now that when I think about it, we actually covered all 3 of them in our conversation without even specifically pointing out them. But when we look at the recycling, we look at the end of usage of the product. And it seems to me that it is a lot about designing from waste to some extent. Whereas the second pillar that I mentioned was designing out waste and pollution. Do you think this is something attainable? Can this be achieved within textiles industry?
So actually there's a really great paper that you can read about zero waste design, which is by Holly McQuillan. I would advise anyone to have a read of her stuff. She does some amazing work. Check out her Instagram. But this idea of, yeah, that we're coming from this sort of designing with waste. Holly's obviously looking at designing it out. My research is actually looking at how we can design with waste, so we can recycle those kind of wool, acrylic, textile fibers, use them, but design them in a way that they can be re-recycled. And that re-recycling and getting it back round is kind of what we're missing at the moment. You'll look around and you'll see brands and they're using recycled materials, and that's brilliant. But it's that bit of making sure that it can come back into the system, because at the moment the recycling system is not great. It's not brilliant, and the materials that we're getting out of them are sort of the higher value materials, and then we're kind of plugging them into things that are going to end up being low value when they come back in again. So it's really about understanding how you can get it back round. That is the big challenge that I'm looking into.
Do you see any particular technology laggage in the system right now that could help facilitate?
Well, there's lots of things. So in terms of collecting, just better collecting systems, basically, in terms of sorting, more transparency, more understanding of sorting. And there is research going on, particular, I can think of circular economy, which is based in Amsterdam. They're working on, or have been working on, the fiber sort project with Van Baling Systems, I believe. And that's looking at how we can automate the sorting process, and machines will be able to just scan and read our clothing. But that comes with limitations. There are other types of sorting that we could use tags, whether they are physical tags or whether they are electric chips that are embedded within our textiles. So there's a variety of different technologies. And then, of course, when you come to recycling, we're developing sort of chemical recycling and different ways of not only recycling, say, cotton or polyester or wool, for example, to split apart polycotton or the different blends that we're using, again with certain limitations. So there's plenty of innovation and technologies that can be being used, and that's covering 3 very basic categories. When you think about the entire life cycle and the different technologies and the different things that can be implemented, the list, I'm sure, is endless.
Absolutely. Do you have high hopes for the improvement in textiles industry within the upcoming 5 to 10 years, let's say?
So I think I'm seeing, it's what's really nice is that we are seeing this sort of shift. Like the consumer is really demanding from the brands that they are more sustainable. It's being noted in business publications that businesses, unless they've got this, sustainability, and they've got that part of their business model, or they're producing sustainable products, that the customers are getting less and less interested, and that's really, really positive. But we are also seeing that there are a lot of these commitments being made which aren't necessarily translating into actual changes. for example. What I will say is that as a consumer, you can definitely push for more changes, and I think we should, and buying power is very powerful, but consumers can't do it alone. Really large corporate companies have been working in the same ways for years and years and years, and it's very, very difficult, like moving a tanker ship that's going in one direction. It's very, very difficult to move that, and these are big corporations that involve huge supply chains, and that's not me excusing them for not moving quicker or trying to do better or changing things, but these things do take time. I feel it's the small kind of startup companies that have slightly more flexibility. They also have limitations, difficult to get hold of, the more expensive materials, chemically recycled materials, for example, that someone like H&M has access to because they have that kind of profit behind them. So I feel like it's actually a collaborative effort. And I think in the next 5 to 10 years, I hope that we have kind of moved forward slightly, probably not as much as I would like. But yeah, hopefully we're only moving in a positive way.
Okay, I also am on the same page with you. I have high hopes that the industry will change and we will see new initiatives and technological changes such as blockchain solutions and more transparency and other solutions such as material passport, if it's applicable in a physical or digital shape and form. But just looking a little bit closer in the time frame, have you seen any particular trends due to COVID-19 pandemic? Has anything changed? Has there been any talk in the news?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the pandemic, what a crazy time it's been. It's been crazy for everybody. And I was talking to somebody who worked for a fashion brand, and they were having lots of problems transporting the clothes from China. They're being produced in China, but they weren't able to move the clothing. No one was flying. And even by car and truck, at every border, they would have to quarantine for 2 weeks. They couldn't find drivers. It was a nightmare. They were worried they weren't going to have clothes in the stores. So the pandemic has completely, changed a lot. And I think probably has pushed us, or at least the industry, and I'm hoping, to think about how change can happen faster. We all overnight suddenly had to start working from home. And now do meetings online and have conversations over Instagram. And I think that sort of rapid change sort of does demonstrate that we can change, and we can change quite quickly when we need to. It's just about making everybody kind of agree that how we need to change and what we need to change. And now that we kind of know that we can do it quickly, I hope that this is sort of demonstrate that you can change things when absolutely necessary. So yeah, I kind of feel like I'm trying to see the positive in the pandemic. I mean, I know it's been absolutely dreadful for a lot of people around the world. But hopefully, when we look back at this period of time, we can see some of the positives that came out of it, and hopefully that's one of them.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have also just got some news that we managed to postpone the overconsumption day of the natural resources by 3 weeks. So amazing. Yesterday was the day when we overused the Earth's capacity in 2019, and this year we moved it to for 3 weeks further, just because we slowed down during pandemic. And talking about the impact, I can also see a comment of one of our listeners who says that it is such a fascinating point about the impact of individuals' transportation to acquire garments that really complicated the argument of the impact of shipping costs for online shopping. Do you have any comments on the impact, on the individual impact?
Yeah, so online shopping, there is obviously an argument that rather than people sort of, specifically if you live in the countryside, so when you're in the countryside, you tend to own a car, you tend to drive into town in order to go shopping, etc., etc. So that was a really interesting piece of research, but obviously has to be thought about in context, in terms of in the city, you might be able to walk to the shops, and therefore ordering online, the addition of postage and that kind of thing. But I don't think that ordering online and having things delivered is going to go away. It potentially drives consumption, potentially because you order things but you send them back in terms of delivery. I would say that more understanding and research needs to be done of the impacts of those kind of delivery services. What is better about those services, and I know because I've ordered things online before, is quite often you get the choice of the most green time slot. So I was given a choice of, I could have it between this hour, this hour, this hour. But if I chose this one, this was the most green, probably because the delivery man was also delivering another package in my area during that time. So there is something to be said about a reduction in transport with online. And actually, with something like online, I know that we see lots of fast fashion companies online, and they are very much branded as the devil, and often they are. But in terms of kind of online, it means that you can have sort of smaller quantities, you know, kind of made to order rather than having a shop. It means if you're a small business and you're online, you don't have to pay for those kind of overheads. It's a bit easier for starting up. So there are loads of pros and cons. They're all kind of linked to sustainability generally. So yeah, it's complicated.
It is complicated, but let's hope for the best. Let's hope that the progress will happen someday soon, and hopefully sooner than later. Actually, we've been talking together for almost about an hour by far, and the time just flew, at least to me. And I just have to also move our conversation to one part that I always do with our guests, which is the section of fill in the gaps. So I have prepared you 5 statements, which I will ask you to complete, and just feel free to complete them within the sustainable textile realm. But I will just start with the first statement then, which is, to me, sustainability is?
So to me, textile sustainability is designing textiles for every element of the life cycle.
Okay, yeah. That incorporates it all, that what we just talked about as well. All right. One thing I would like to see more of in the world is? Well,
because it's what I'm doing on my PhD, I have to say recycled textiles.
Of course. That's a really good answer. And then we can move forward from that point, right? I mean, perfect. For a complete beginner in the textile sustainability area, I would suggest to start off with.
So this one, I would probably say, as a complete beginner, there are loads of resources out there. So I've mentioned quite a few. You've mentioned the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. There's a great report called the New Textile Economy, which really addresses the problem. The Centre for Circular Design has a YouTube channel if you're a designer and looking for design tools and how to use them. And obviously, I'm going to plug my own website, annekatextiles.co.uk. I've got some resources. I did a webinar, so if you're interested in textile recycling and finding out more, then check me out.
Absolutely. I can only agree to this point, because I have visited your website quite a lot of times while preparing for the interview. I have found a lot of great material there. So guys, don't be modest, just really give it a go. And then moving on to the next statement. Every sustainable business
should try and implement at least one like circular sustainable strategy. So when I say try and implement one, sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming. So we talk about this entire life cycle and collaborating with everyone and thinking about every single point, which can be really, really overwhelming. And as I already talked about, there are some compromises to be made. So kind of set your goals and think about one thing that you can do, and yeah, kind of one step at a time, I guess.
That's a really good advice. Starting from one thing. Mm-hmm. And the last statement is, in 2 to 3 years, I see Anneka Textiles.
Kind of doing what I'm doing, but just more teaching, researching, and consulting. That's what I love.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. So you do a consultancy for the businesses and webinars for designers, or?
Yeah, so I'm teaching, and I teach across universities. I run workshops and things. Obviously, I'm doing my PhD research and hope to sort of continue that. But I run consultancy for anyone who's interested in learning about circular design, particularly businesses interested in developing recycled materials and some of the problems. If you're a small business or a big business that are looking to understand how to design and create recycled materials, particularly that can be re-recycled, hopefully I'm your girl.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah. And then just to summarize our conversation, what would you say are the 3 key takeaways you would like everyone to take from our talk today?
Okay, so I would say I have a takeaway for the consumer, I have a takeaway for big business, and I have a takeaway for designers that might be listening to this. So for the consumer, I would say don't throw any of your clothes away. Please make sure that you recycle them, and that includes socks and tights and pants. Make sure they go into those recycling bins and don't put anything in the trash. Also, you have buying power. So buy sustainably and responsibly as you possibly can. For big business, I would, I guess, going back to what I said before about implementing sustainable strategies. If you don't know where to start, just take it one step at a time. Start small and work your way up to sort of implement change. And then for designers out there, think about how sustainability or circular design can be implemented in all of your design. It's really easy to be working on a sustainable design project in which you are really keen about implementing all of these different strategies. But particularly, I see this in students when I'm teaching, when they move on to another project where sustainability isn't part of, say, the marking criteria. And the same in designers, you know, within the industry, it's, oh, there's this specific project, but then we just go back to business as usual. The challenge is, can you implement some of those things within sort of everyday designing in all the different projects that you do? And those would be the 3 takeaways that I, in terms of circular design.
These are very strong key takeaways to which I highly agree as well. We have 1 last minute left. So I would just like to thank you, Anneka, for spending your time in this lovely Thursday evening with us, sharing your best knowledge about mechanical recycling and all the other great topics. I would advise everyone to visit your website, annekatextiles.co.uk, and find out more about mechanical recycling if you're interested. There's a great webinar published there. Yes, thanks everyone who joined, who questioned, who wrote your comments. It's been a great pleasure for me to have you here, and I wish everyone a very nice Thursday evening.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I've really enjoyed myself. Have a lovely evening, everybody.
Thank you so much.